Greetings. It seems Remy Ilona has offered a response to some of the recent criticisms his methodology has received. And perhaps it might be described as an indirect response, insofar that in his new video, he doesn't share a link to what he's responding to, nor does he explicitly mention who he might be responding to. But I would nonetheless say that one can get an accurate sense of who he's probably replying to, and I think I might be included in that. Now, in this video that he recently put out, he just put it out yesterday, Remy seems to be attempting to tackle the objection that culture is not a reliable tool for determining paternal lineage across millennia, right? And precisely because culture can change, right? So Remy has proposed that you can determine ancestry across millennia by looking at the culture of a group, and my objection was that it's not a good tool precisely because culture can change, right? And so we're going to pick this up at just before the 5-minute mark, where Remy seems to hint that while it might be easy for people to lose their culture in America, such is not so easy for people in Nigeria. Here's the clip and fair use.
It has come to my attention that people who do not know Nigeria could be assuming that conditions prevalent in the United States or United States, could also be applicable in places like Nigeria. Societies are completely different. My family, my ethnic group has been on one piece of land for at least 1,200 years. The Yorubas have been on one piece of land for at least 1,200 years. It is not easy for Yorubas and Igbos to lose their culture.
Okay, so my preliminary objection would be that the very next day, actually just this morning, Remy himself put up a Facebook post arguing that Igbos were plausibly at risk of losing their culture were it not for efforts to get them to return to a culture which Remy elsewhere assures you it would be difficult to lose, right? That's interesting. And so too, also today, Remy also put up a post documenting cultural change among Yoruba, right? As he mentioned that certain Yoruba Muslims are attempting to prohibit an Ifa-related festival in certain regions, right? So again, that implies a sort of division and a sort of cultural change, wouldn't it? But that aside, while Remy often alludes to alleged cultural similarities between practitioners of Omenana and the biblical Israelites, I would wager that if a detailed comparison was made, there would be a lot of differences as well. You know, honestly, I think it's obvious that between biblical Israelites and Igbos, there are profound linguistic differences, as well as a different calendar and different feast days, you know? So if Igbos descend from biblical Israelites, this would seem to entail profound cultural changes. And perhaps it would also imply an utter loss of the literary tradition, at least so far as it pertains to liturgical use of texts written in Semitic languages, whether they be Hebrew or Aramaic. And again, that itself would seem to arguably constitute cultural change. Now, if Remy or anyone else wants to disagree, I would ask what evidence is there of Igbos using texts in Hebrew and Aramaic prior to European contact? In fact, what's the oldest Torah scroll or prayer book in Hebrew or Aramaic amongst the Igbos? That'd be an interesting question. And if there is no such thing, again, that would seem to constitute a loss of that literary tradition. And honestly, we're really just scratching the surface here, which is to say that a detailed discussion on this topic of comparing Omenana and, the biblical Israelite customs, that has hardly begun to get off the ground. But maybe that's a subject for future exploration. But now I want to show another clip in which Remy addresses the objection that he had a video titled Abraham's Culture Changed, which implied culture can change, right? See, again, Remy was proposing that you should look to culture to determine ancestry across millennia. And I had pointed out that it's somewhat ironic that he's saying this in a video titled Abraham's Culture Changed, right? Because what I had pointed out that the objection that one's going to reach for is right there in the title, right? But so here's his response to that. And again, fair use.
When I stated in one of my previous presentations that Abraham's culture changed, I was specific about Abraham. I was not talking about anybody else. Abraham was asked by God to move away from his homeland. Abraham moved away from his homeland and his culture changed. It is different from the culture of the Yorubas and the culture of the Igbos changing.
Okay, now I would ask that you think about the argument which is being made here. On the one hand, Remy argues that culture is the best indicator of ancestry. Yet on the other hand, Remy just proposed that Abraham's culture was different from that of his immediate ancestors. Right? That latter position would mean that culture is not a good indicator of ancestry, as one can differ culturally even from their recent ancestors. And beyond that, Remy recently insinuated that Yoruba might be Ishmaelites. Now, admittedly, his position is not clear regarding who the Yoruba are, as previously he's called them Hamites as well. But for now, let's work within this idea that he's proposed of the Yoruba possibly being Ishmaelites. So Remy has proposed the following. He's proposed that Igbos are Israelites. He's proposed that Yoruba might be Ishmaelites. And he's proposed that Igbos and Yoruba have profoundly different cultures. But that raises a question. Wouldn't both Israelites and Ishmaelites be descendants of Abraham? And the reason why that question is important is because it would imply that at least one group of Abraham's descendants has undergone profound cultural change, which would again entail that culture does not tell us about ancestry. Right? In short, the argument becomes self-defeating. The different positions that Remy is taking seem to, with all due respect to him, these different positions seem to be contradicting each other. But that said, let's return to Remy's older assertion that the Yoruba are Hamites. Now, I showed this post from last year in my previous video, but when I showed it the previous time, I merely focused on the fact that it calls Igbo Semites and Yoruba Hamites. Now I'd like to look at the larger sentence in which that claim falls. You see, Remy declared the following, quote, "The languages of the Igbos, who are Semites, and the Yoruba, who are Hamites, began to separate in the Levant," end quote. Now think about the implications here. Remy accepts that there was once a single common language from which both the Yoruba language and the Igbo language descend. Now, I wonder what Remy thinks that language was like. Presumably it was some sort of Volta Congo language, right? Yet Remy says it began to divide in the Levant. And beyond that, beyond the awkwardness of a Volta Congo language being spoken in the Levant, at least I don't see any evidence of that. One would have to think that this language was profoundly different from Biblical Hebrew. And now this raises a number of questions, such as, for example, does Remy think Biblical Hebrew sprang from that language? Does he think the current Igbo language sprang from Biblical Hebrew? And honestly, whichever way Remy goes with this, it's going to imply what I alluded to earlier, which is a profound sort of linguistic change, where the language is changing, and which in turn would seem to fly in the face of the assurance that culture has remained stable across millennia, right? Because language is deeply intertwined with culture, and it seems like there's major linguistic change happening here, even within the history that's proposed or imagined by Remy Ilona. But moving away from that, I'd now like to look at another Facebook post which Mr. Ilona put up yesterday. And in this one, he addresses the objection about the letters which the Jewish community of London gave to William Simpson before his exploration of Africa. Recall that Remy had claimed that those letters were addressed specifically to the Igbos. So one immediate objection, was that neither letter ever mentions the Igbos. And so with that in mind, starting with where the red asterisk appears on your screen, this is how Remy responds. He responds as follows, quote, "There's now major controversy online about the letter by London-based rabbis addressed to our brothers on the banks of the Niger River. Quote-unquote experts are already saying that it didn't mention Igbos by name. It didn't mention Igbos by name, but Igbos can demonstrate that they mentioned in writing that they circumcised boys at the 8th day over 200 years ago, and that they lived on the banks of the Niger in 1841. And meanwhile, these quote-unquote experts cannot mention the name of one of the ethnic groups that live on the banks of Nigeria. challenged them to get one person from those imagined groups to demonstrate their nations have clear Israelite traditions, and be sure they will sneak away. Did those other peoples the letter could have been addressed to dissolve like salt? End quote. Now, honestly, these sorts of rhetorical questions are loaded, and frankly, they're misleading. Remy seems to think, or he wants you to think, that the explorers were bringing the letters to a very specific people in a specific location whom they were already aware of and who were already recognized as Jews. But as was covered in my previous video, Simpson was given the letters just in case they found Jews during their exploration of the interior of Africa, right? And it's not like they were bringing the letters specifically to the Igbo territory, as if they already recognize Igbos as Jews. Rather, the explorers were going to multiple places in Africa, including, but not necessarily limited to, multiple places along the Niger River. And they had those letters from the Jewish community in London with them just in case they encountered Jews at some point during their exploration of these various locations, right? Now, that raises another question, and that's why does Remy's description misrepresent the fact of the matter? And as far as I can see, the best case scenario that I can come up with is that Remy himself may merely be going by the English translation of the shorter letter, which was given to Simpson. You see, Remy recently posted an English translation of the letter, which is found in Daniel Lee's book, Jewish Identity Among the Igbo of Nigeria. And that loose translation refers to, quote, the nation situated on the river Niger, end quote. So it might just be the case that Remy sincerely thinks the letters were addressed to a very specific nation on the Niger River. And he could think that because a loose English translation gives that impression. So with that in mind, let's look at what the letter actually states. The opening two words are ha'af umnam, which is like saying surely indeed or verily, or it is certainly the case that, and then it continues. Ha'holech besfinat Wilberforce, eneno mibnei amenu, the one who travels in the ship Wilberforce is not from our nation. Weshmo William Simpson, hu ha'holech bereshut hamalcha, and his name is William Simpson. He is the one who travels with the permission of the Queen. Yara lenahar negor lichakur velidarush ma yimtsa shma. He penetrated to the river Niger to search and to study what he might find there. And then the rest of the letter just talks about how Simpson is known to the Jewish community where he's from, and how he won't agitate for other religions, and how he loves Israel, right? But suffice to say, the actual text of the letter never mentions any specific nation on the Niger River. And it seems that Remy saw something along those lines in a rather loose English translation of the letter, and therefore might have assumed it meant the letter was targeted at a specific community, and a community which was already known on the river, whose location and Jewishness was already known. But that was simply not the case. As was already noted, the letters were given just in case Jews were encountered along the way. But there was no indication that the authors or the explorers had a specific community in mind. Therefore, the claim that these letters were intended for specifically the Igbos is, with all due respect, it's without merit. And it does not serve as evidence of Jewish recognition of Igbos as Israelites. And with that, I'll close this video here. As always, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms. You see, I don't censor anyone here, so feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. And God bless.